How will Emmanuel Macron's G7 be remembered? As the sun sets on the southwestern French resort of Biarritz, departing leaders can reflect on the barbs traded with Brazil's president. Arguments over dinner about whether to reverse Russia's exclusion from the group of 7 industrialized nations raised hopes on compromise over the taxing of internet giants and Iran. After the surprise invite of Iran's foreign minister to the sidelines of the summit, the French president raising hopes of a meeting between Donald Trump and Hassan Rouhani within weeks. Has Macron succeeded in reviving the Iran deal? Has Trump tempered his stated dislike for multilateral solutions to global problems? The G7 club of like-minded liberal democracies has suffered its share of knocks since the U.S. president came to power. Already its economic clout has been watered down with the rise of the likes of China. Now, what next for a G7 that, by the way, next convenes in 2020 and whose host will be a certain Donald Trump? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Macron's G7. Joining us from Biarritz, Hélène Emmanuel, Paris office director for the G7 Research Group. We want to welcome as well Annick Cizel, a senior lecturer in U.S. foreign policy at the Sorbonne University, at the University of Sorbonne Nouvelle, right? Thank you. Welcome back to the show. Thomas Friang is president of the Open Diplomacy Institute. Thank you for joining us. And we're joined from Washington, D.C. by Behnam Taleblu, senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, hashtag F24debate. So, did we just witness a breakthrough that could lead to the first face-to-face meeting between the leaders of the U.S. and Iran since before 1979? Emmanuel Macron hoping for that meeting within weeks.
This morning, President Rouhani clearly said that he was ready to meet any political leaders if it was in his country's interest. What I said to Foreign Minister Zarif and to President Rouhani over the phone was that I was sure if he agreed to meet President Trump, then an agreement could be reached. If we set our objectives and sit down at a table, then we'll get there. So I hope that in the coming weeks, based on these discussions, we'll succeed in having a summit meeting between President Rouhani and President Trump.
I
think that Iran is a country of tremendous potential. We're not looking for leadership change. We're not looking for that kind of change. This country has been through that many times before. That doesn't work. We're looking for no nuclear weapons, no ballistic missiles, and a longer period of time. Very simple. We can have it done in a very short period of time. They have to be good players. You understand what that means? And they can't do what they were saying they're going to do, because if they do that, they're going to be met with really very violent force. We have no choice.
Hélène Emmanuel, did we witness a breakthrough or not?
I think this is a significant step forward when it comes to the United States and the Iran agreement. During Emmanuel Macron and Donald Trump's joint press conference, we saw for one of the first times Donald Trump lay out kind of a clearer idea of what he actually wants in a new agreement. He wants it to be for a longer period of time. So the current agreement was made in 2015 and will expire in 2025. He thinks the agreement should be longer. He also wants it to cover more missile sites. And I think the fact that he said that he's willing to meet with President Rouhani and that Emmanuel Macron thinks that it might happen in the next couple of weeks is a positive step forward when it comes to the geopolitical situation with Iran.
Of course, and I'll put this to Annick Cizel, we can now look at Donald Trump's Twitter feed because past summits have ended with agreements, and then a few hours later out comes a tweet. What do you agree, though, with Hélène that maybe we are witnessing something?
Well, we've definitely heard some discourse which I wish could be performative for once and not just rhetorical. Most definitely steps forward we have seen in the sense that President Trump has been, shall I say, shy these past couple of days, shy with Twitter, not commenting live on what was taking place, commenting on what was taking place at home, but not at the G7, behaving like a diplomat, truly trying to be civil with with the people around him, which is not what we were used to. So trying to somehow police himself and get himself into his presidential clothes and actually try and
Why?
talk with other people.
Why?
Now, why? First, of course, elections is what comes to mind. And this is what he had in mind throughout the G7. You follow his Twitter feed. He was running his presidential campaign, bashing on Hillary Clinton, just the same way that during his press conference, he bashed on Obama. So definitely that's the first thing he had in mind. Trying to appear presidential and not, as usual, the temperamental, okay, I'm going to get back on my plane, or I'm going to just kick everything from the table, which would not have looked good and which would definitely have fed the press back home when he was landing in Washington, D.C. For all this good behavior, if I may call it this way, and Boris Johnson was on his best behavior too, so I guess this was like the litmus test to Donald Trump to try and not behave worse than Boris Johnson. But at the same time, I wish I were as hopeful as Emmanuel Macron seemed to be tonight, because definitely the Iranian Prime Minister, Zarif, was not exactly foreign minister was not exactly saying the same thing. If anything, to your own journalist here at France 24, 3 days before, saying we will not negotiate on missiles, for instance. So the consensus at the G7 that Iran is too expansionist in the region and that Iran should curtail its missile testing, etc., building, at the same time as renegotiate the JCPOA, the nuclear part of the JCPOA, this full package for the Iranians right now is a no way. So getting a meeting between the two leaders is one thing, between Donald Trump and Hassan Rouhani is one thing. But if the Iranians agree to renegotiate on the basis of what President Trump is putting forward right now.
They definitely seem to be talking about a roadmap. Benem Taliblu, we had Emmanuel Macron saying, I can't comment on certain things because they're sensitive. Do you feel as though there is perhaps something happening?
Well, I think the first and most important thing that is happening is the evolution of the role of France within the P5, as well as something of a mediator between the U.S. and Iran. If you recall, in April of 2018, the French president went to the United States, and there he unveiled a four-pillared or a four-point plan to keep the U.S. in the JCPOA and use the JCPOA nuclear deal as a framework to get a bigger, broader, and more comprehensive deal that addresses regional issues. Now you hear Emmanuel Macron talking not about a four-pillar or a four-point plan, but rather a two-pronged approach. One which is, of course, a measure of consensus within the G7 that they don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. And the other, of course, is that the members of the G7 have a distaste for what Iran is doing in the region, which is sowing the seeds of instability and chaos. That's the first big takeaway. The second is, I think, Emmanuel Macron kind of winked, nudged, hinted at something that could happen on the sidelines of the UNGA, even though I don't necessarily think it's possible. He raised the specter of something between President Rouhani of Iran and President Trump of the U.S. on the sidelines of the UNGA. That's, again, the next big major diplomatic marker in the coming weeks. It's the place where U.S. and Iranian presidents have attempted to meet before. We know President Clinton tried to meet Iran's reformist President Khatami there. Khatami hid in the bathroom. And we know that in 2013, 2 months before the interim nuclear deal was agreed to between the U.S. and Iran and the P5+1, President Obama and President Rouhani actually had a phone call there. So it's not unnatural for the UNGA to be used as such a venue, and it's not unnatural for foreign leaders to try to point to that venue as something, as a major diplomatic milestone. I would be doubtful, however, though, that those three things the president mentioned are the only things U.S. policy is concerned about when it comes to Iran. If you remember, Secretary Pompeo in May 2018 laid out 12 points, which actually go further. And I think the president just kind of gave a summary of some of the key issues that the U.S. has with the nuclear deal, but that is just in the nuclear file alone. ballistic missiles as a way to deliver nuclear warheads, the inspections regime, the sunset clauses. Remember, this is what Europe and America tried to work on from January to May of 2018 to fix the JCPOA nuclear deal before they left. U.S. policy towards Iran has much bigger problems than just fixing the deal or building on the deal or getting a new nuclear deal. It is still struggling to find a way to work on that second track that Macron talked about, which is the regional security framework and how to stop Iranian expansionism. And it's there that you've seen European states support America rhetorically, but not actually develop policies, whether they're sanctions or other coercive measures to stop Iran in the region.
Thomas Friong, you agree with Benham that there maybe could be something at the UN General Assembly, but it's way too early to say.
I think it is way too early, and we have witnessed something that was unexpected, which was this meeting with the Foreign Minister of Iran. But preparing a high-level meeting between the president of Iran and the president of the US takes a long time. And ahead of the next UN General Assembly, there is much on the agenda, including the special summit of the UN Secretary General to foster and accelerate the implementation of the Paris Accord on climate change. And that might be a most demanding priority on the agenda, plus including the fact that the president of France, Macron, who was actually leading the table in Biarritz, his priority in foreign policy is definitely climate. And he might put more the emphasis on preparing the UN Special Summit on Climate than their thing on Iran.
If push came to shove, that's the one he would choose to focus
so.
on. Benham Taleblu, the U.S. president, all praise for Emmanuel Macron, who, as our correspondent was saying, didn't come up with a final communique, but instead talking points at the end of this summit. Of course, everyone's spooked by what happened last year in Quebec, where Donald Trump refused to sign the final communique. Has Macron figured out the way to handle the U.S. president?
Well, we know that the U.S. president has certain friends and allies in different countries. Again, he mentioned Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan. We know that Macron, again, shares a close personal relationship with the president. And I think different world leaders are jockeying for different positions, both within the president's kind of friendship circle, as well as within a way to make their country a better ally, partner, more strategic use to the United States. And I think President Macron, by ending the G7 with this kind of handing off of the baton, if you will, between himself and President Trump, because in 2020, the G7 is going to be held in the United States, and it will be President Trump, I think, before the election commences, who will be leading that summit there in the United States. I think President Macron figured out an appropriate venue, an appropriate framing for current leader, future leader of the G7, as well as a vector for himself to put France's interests first and present them as something more multilateral and something that could be agreed upon even within this administration.
All right. Donald Trump, again, saying no surprises at the next G7 that he'll host in 2020. Nothing on par with that invite extended on Sunday to Iran's foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, who tweeted on Sunday, "The road ahead is difficult, but worth trying." Hélène Maureen, what was the reaction where you are when Zarif showed up at the G7?
It was a big surprise. It really took everyone by surprise. And we had certain sources saying that even France's close partners like German Chancellor Angela Merkel were really told at the last minute. But I think it speaks to Emmanuel Macron's broader strategy to kind of position himself as a leader when it comes to this Iran dossier, and even as a leader for Europe. In a certain sense, the geopolitical stars kind of aligned when it came to this G7 summit for Macron to play this role of leader. You have on one hand, Angela Merkel is exiting the German chancellery in a little bit. You have Giuseppe Conte, the Italian leader, who is on his way out. Jean-Claude Juncker from the EU was unable to attend because of an injury. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson monopolized by Brexit. And because Emmanuel Macron was the host of this G7 summit, he could set the agenda, he could set the tone, he could set the issues that he wanted to talk about. So he was really dealt a great hand when it came to positioning himself as a leader and as a mediator. And when you look at the way he handled Iran, you can clearly say that he's positioning himself as a mediator between the United States and Iran. And so this surprise visit, the Iranian foreign affairs minister, just kind of plays into his diplomatic strategy to show that France is taking leadership on this file and has an important role to play.
And the fact that Macron, as early as Saturday, warned Trump of the arrival of Mohammad Javad Zarif, but didn't tell his European counterparts.
Well, we saw during Emmanuel Macron and Donald Trump's joint press conference that both leaders really went to great lengths to show that they're both acting in unity. Emmanuel Macron got a lot of questions. Did you ask Donald Trump for his permission to invite the Iranian foreign affairs minister? Was Donald Trump aware of this? And, Macron kind of had to show that he was acting on France's behalf. And no, he did not ask Donald Trump's permission, but he did let him know ahead of time. And I think it's also part of Emmanuel Macron's strategy to manage Donald Trump. You alluded to this before, but last year at the G7 in Charlevoix in Quebec, Donald Trump really caused a big issue when he withdrew from the final communique via a tweet, breaking diplomatic norms. That's never been done in the past. So I think that this was all part of Emmanuel Macron's strategy to kind of manage Donald Trump, but also to show that the G7 can still act in unity, especially because the G7 has been called into question precisely because since Donald Trump's election, it really has appeared as sort of the G6+1, with the United States isolated on a whole range of issues from Iran to climate change. So what I really sort of remember from this G7 summit is the efforts that were really put into play to show the unity between Donald Trump, between Emmanuel Macron, and the G7 as a whole.
The fact that all these efforts are being made, does it in fact make it the G6+1?
Somehow I had the feeling I witnessed the G6+1, but because Emmanuel Macron chose to. He chose to place America first. He did exactly what Donald Trump was expecting him to do. What had bonded these two presidents together at the top of the Eiffel Tower on a certain Bastille Day, once upon a time in their bromance at the time. And that's the way Macron played it this time. Placing America first, placing the American president first, center stage throughout the G7, so that just the same way he didn't leave the position of French ambassador in Washington, D.C. vacant too long, and sent actually his first diplomatic advisor to as French ambassador to D.C., showing President Trump how important America is, and the president, of course, as the representative of America. And this played also emphasizing what the two presidents have in common, because they do have things in common. They have in common their pragmatism, the fact that both of them are impatient for very different reasons, but they like to get things done immediately. And this idea of having a set of projects instead of, I definitely agree with all the reasons that were just given as to why a communique was a bad reason. But listing a list of projects is exactly what Trump is going to adhere to. The same way as the Iran deal that President Macron is pushing forward is an economic sort of Marshall Plan for Iran. Let's make Iran rich. The same way the Kushner plan for the Palestinians could make the Palestinians rich, forgetting the same nuance, the same subtlety, that political sovereignty is what the Iranians want first.
All right. When we come back, we're going to look at some of the other issues that dominated this G7, including climate. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're closing the G7 summit. So the G7 summit, which dates back to 1975. We're talking about it from the southwestern French resort of Biarritz, Hélène Emmanuel, who is the Paris office director for the G7 research group. Welcome back to the show. Welcome back as well to Annick Cizel, who teaches on foreign policy and U.S. transatlantic relations at the Sorbonne Nouvelle University. Thomas Friong, president of the Open Diplomacy Institute, and from Washington, D.C., Benjamin Talablu, senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Emmanuel Macron did not pick fights with Donald Trump at this G7 summit, but he did with his Brazilian counterpart, Macron, who was asked about Jair Bolsonaro's disparaging Facebook comment on the looks of his wife, Brigitte.
We'll
immediately offer financial support of at least 20 million euros to the Amazonian countries that let us know what they need. And we'll also offer concrete support, military support in the region in the coming hours. In the next month, we'll build an initiative for the Amazon that will be officially launched at the UN General Assembly. What can I say? It's sad. It's sad for him, firstly, and for Brazilians. I think Brazilian women are probably ashamed to see that about their president. And I think Brazilians, who have a great nation, are ashamed to see this behavior. They expect their president to behave well towards others. And since I have a lot of respect for the Brazilian nation, I hope they'll soon have a president who behaves in the right way.
Thomas Friong, reacting to that reaction, Bolsonaro has on Twitter accused Macron and his ilk of treating the region like a colony or a no man's land. Your thoughts on this?
I think he took it wrong because France is present in the Amazon with Guyana. And
French Guyana is...
France is part of the 9 countries which is obviously worried and directly concerned by what's happening there. It's obviously one also wrong reason between Brazil and France to take it that way, because everyone knows that the top priority of French diplomacy now is climate. And for those two reasons, that was exactly the kind of trigger that President Macron was actually expecting to take the role of the G7 chair. Obviously, G7 has an history in both delivering some concrete objects of foreign policy that my fellow here was referring to earlier, including climate or gender equality. But it also has a past in Ukraine, or recalling what the minister said before, that was also achieved. But the last feature that G7 has always is reacting to last-minute catastrophe, and knowing that France was actually, as a climate-leading country, chairing the G7 was a mistake to forget that from the Brazilian counterpart, because they could have expected that as the G7 leader, Macron would have reacted really harsh.
Could have reacted really harshly. Hélène Emmanuel, what do you make of what's concretely come out of this G7 summit when it comes to fighting against global warming?
Well, one of the biggest sort of advantages of the G7 is because it's such an informal forum. When it comes to issues that pop up that aren't on the formal agenda, like the Amazon fires, it can be discussed and dealt with at the G7. And that's precisely what happened here. The Amazon was really a big focus here in Biarritz. And earlier this morning, we had Emmanuel Macron, the Chilean president, announce 2 concrete efforts with regards to the Amazon. The first one being financial and expert support. So like you said, France is pledging 20 million euros. Canada pledged $15 million. Other G7 partners are pledging other financial resources, also sending in firefighters, equipment, experts, etc. More looking at the long term, Macron said that at the UN General Assembly in September, they will launch a new initiative to try to look at the longer term effects of the Amazon rainforest and to protect and preserve the rainforest. So they'll be working with partners from all countries in the Amazon region. They'll also be working with local and indigenous populations to promote environmentally friendly agriculture, to promote reforestation. So these are concrete commitments that the G7 has taken. They're a good step in the right direction. At press conference, like we heard earlier in the clip, we heard a very rare rebuke from Emmanuel Macron regarding Bolsonaro. I was at the press conference, and all of us were kind of quite shocked at Emmanuel Macron's response. He's usually someone who's quite diplomatic, and he really did react quite strongly to Bolsonaro's words in a way that is quite uncharacteristic from Macron's part. So it really shows that Bolsonaro's words really touched him in a way that is unusual for the French president.
Benem Taleblu, at the joint press conference between Emmanuel Macron and Donald Trump, no mention was made of the fact that Trump did not attend the climate panel of the G7 summit. This social media spat between Macron and Bolsonaro, a bit of a useful distraction?
Excellent point. I don't think it was a useful distraction. I think when Emmanuel Macron led the press conference by his own statement first, he mentioned biosecurity, he mentioned the environment. If I'm not mistaken, he also may have mentioned the Amazon. But that was used more as a pivot to begin to discuss the issues where there was some convergence between the U.S. and America. And allegedly, that is on the one issue that actually, in terms of foreign policy, French foreign policy, American foreign policy, British foreign policy, Canadian foreign policy, and whatnot, there is great divergence, and that is the issue of Iran. So I think the French president used it as an opportunity to say, here's where there is unity, even though he may have been excluding the U.S. because the American president did not attend the summit on the environment earlier, but then quickly drove to an area of great interest for Washington, and that is the Iran issue. And I think, again, whether it's the comments by, I think, Brazilian officials or anyone else, it all really played into Macron's hands. And I'm not sure if the U.S. president was aware of it or not, but when he said, good job at the end, I think the French president did, in fact, do a good job. He skillfully navigated several different challenges, whether they were personal, political, or even policy related.
Yeah, because Annick Cizel was mentioning in part one of our discussion how the relationship between Macron and Trump, we saw first the bromance part with that Bastille Day parade where Trump attended. Then we saw a definite chill with last September at the UN General Assembly, Macron effectively lecturing Trump on the issue of the environment. Today, it's all rosy again, it seems. Is it going to be back to square one when the UNGA meets next month in New York?
I think broadly the Franco-American relationship is strong enough to suffer through any peaks and troughs, but I would be careful not to characterize, I think, some of Macron's pushback on U.S. foreign policy or even areas of personal divergence between him and Trump, whether it's on the environment or even Russia, as a real divergence between Franco-American policy. And the reason I say that is because when Macron left the States last April, with the feeling in his stomach, which I think he shared with a group at George Washington University, that ultimately his trip to get the U.S. to stay in the nuclear deal was for naught, and he thought the president was going to pull out anyway, and the U.S.-Franco relationship continued. I think that just kind of points to the fact that this relationship is strong enough and can go through so many of these peaks and troughs. And again, many saw the D-Day celebrations and Macron's speech there as a lecture to the president. I don't think so. I think these themes, whether it's multilateralism or the environment, this is stuff that the French president believes and is going to use any venue to push forward. And the areas where there is convergence with the U.S., he'll likely broaden the coalition. But the areas where there isn't, I think there is a desire within France and personally within the president himself in France to push forward solo or absent the United States.
All right, that brings us to the issue of just how useful a talk shop is. The G7, the next one, as we were saying, will probably be in Miami, according to Donald Trump, the U.S. Cornerstone of this club ever since its founding back in 1975, a cornerstone, well, up to recently. James Vizina has more.
November 1975. 6 of the most powerful heads of state meet in France. A few months after the first oil crisis, French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing convenes what was then known as the Group of Six.
We'll be discussing the issues of trade and international finance.
A year later, the G6 became the G7, as Canada is granted entry into the group. And topics broadened to include climate change, the economy, healthcare and global security. Russia then joined the circle in 1998, but was excluded of the G8 in 2014 after it annexed Crimea from Ukraine.
We'll be meeting tonight the 7 other countries of the G8 to determine the way forward. But frankly, it is Russia that needs to change course. We need to send a very clear message to the Russian government and to President Putin that it would be completely unacceptable to go further into Ukraine.
The United States, France, Italy, Great Britain, Japan, Germany and Canada have since met as the G7. Together they represent 40% of the global GDP and account for 10% of the world's population.
The first meeting of the G7, not far from here, in the suburb of Rambouillet, in the Annick-Cizel. At the time, the club represented half the world's wealth. Today, it's a little more than a third. So times have certainly changed. What do you think? Is it still relevant?
Actually, I think your slip earlier when you called it the G20 summarizes it all. And this is really what the French president has been trying to do, inviting the president from Chile and African heads of state, etc. At some point over the weekend, I had the feeling I was watching a G20 or 15 or something, but a G7+++, taking in globalization, taking in like a G7 for the 21st century, acknowledging that, okay, China wasn't there, Russia wasn't there, Brazil wasn't there, but at the same time, India was there and South Africa was there. And that at the same time, Macron was trying to build a bridge between that old-style Cold War G7 and the G20, which is needed today in the days of globalization. And it's these visions of the world which have clashed beyond the personal thing between Bolsonaro and Macron at this stage. I believe it's the unilateralism of one and the multilateralism of the other that have clashed, and that make me not so hopeful for the United Nations General Assembly next month, because this is really two visions of the world which are still colliding. Somehow it's like Bolsonaro wished he'd been there, like he deserved to be there, so he brought himself in the middle of the G7. The same way Israel clashed with the Hezbollah, I mean Iran's Hezbollah, in Lebanon exactly at the same time. It's like we had partners of the G20 which weren't there, but which brought themselves center stage in the middle of the G7, which is somehow answering your question as to they have the feeling, at least. The rest of the world has the feeling the G7 is obsolete, as Donald Trump would say.
All right, Irene Morin, 2 questions. First of all, did it feel like a G20 light where you are?
That were reserved just for the G7. But other countries like the African leaders that were invited were part of the process from a very early stage. And that's quite rare for the G7. When there are guests, they're usually brought in more at the later stages. But here, the guests really did legitimately have a seat at the table. Their diplomats were involved in almost the very early stages of the negotiations. But to answer your question, I don't think that the G7 is obsolete. Yes, the world has changed. Yes, these 7 countries can no longer set the tone for the rest of the world, but they are a club of like-minded countries with democratic values. And I think that that cannot be understated. And the fact that it allows these leaders who have the same values, who share mostly similar interests, have the opportunity to meet once a year for 2 days and talk face to face is very important when it comes to international relations. To give you a concrete example, just yesterday when Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron had kind of an impromptu lunch. A lot of what they were talking about during this impromptu lunch led to some of the progress we've seen on the Iran file. And so, yes, the G7 can no longer speak on behalf of the rest of the world. And yes, the arrival of the G20 in 2008 has perhaps decreased the relative importance of the G7. But it's important to remember that G7 countries like the US, like France, like the United Kingdom are still very important countries. And the fact that their leaders can come together and speak face to face for 2 days every year, that's a really important tool when it comes to international cooperation and global governance.
Like-minded countries, Thomas Friang, how are they doing? Are they circling the wagons, or what kind of a future do they have, these 7 like-minded countries?
I think we have 3 aspects to take into account. The first aspect is clearly the fact that not only because of the guests at this table of G7, it sounded like a G20, but also because of the topics that were addressed. When we heard about the joint press conference that Trump and Macron had earlier today, they only spoke about Iran, which is a regular topic on the G7 agenda, but mostly about trade and fair globalization with China. And this is the center discussion of the G20 that happened in Osaka last 2 months ago. And second example on that is that Macron pointed out a lot the way that he has featured his vision of global governance to coordinate all relevant international organizations from the IMF to WTO in addressing globalization fairness. And that's essentially the way he tweaked his relationship with Trump, because in developing that argument about a fair globalization, he's directly addressing Trump's electorate during its election. And we all know Trump practices only electoral diplomacy, meaning that he doesn't seek the American interest. He seeks the interest of his own party. And doing so, Macron has found a good way to address Trump. Second example in the future, a second aspect of the future of G7 is that Macron has tried to evolve his strategy to avoid the crash of last year in Charlevoix and directly involve Trump, put him in the center of the G7, because next year Trump he's going to chair the G7, and it's so important for him because next year after that Trump or the next US president will chair the G20, and G20 comes back to trade issue. It's so important for the US. So Trump actually had no choice. He had to have to save the face at the G7 to avoid any clash at next G7 in the US and be ready for the G20.
Rule of law, these nations that are like-minded, as Hélène Emorine put it. Benham Taleblu, the fact that do you agree that it can only be the G7 that can drive, for instance, the progress that we've been told that could see a global digital tax come about, or a fairer way of taxing digital giants?
Ideas, intellectual property in particular.
Go ahead.
Hello?
Yeah, no, we had a...
I was just saying that it likely will be this vector, meaning the G7 could be a leader in such an area if this global tax actually does go through and is initiated. But it's because of this baseline agreement on things like free trade, liberal democratic norms, open institutions, as well as, of course, emerging fintech industries within these countries, as well as the right to intellectual property and intellectual property law in each country in the G7.
So it's impossible to bring in, say, Russia or Japan into the club. Russia or China into the club.
It would significantly complicate it, particularly with China. But in fact, this is one area where it need not be limited to the G7. The G7 can iron out a position and then begin to workshop that position. It can elect a moderator, a mediator. It can have the country with the greatest interest in this begin to essentially lobby and get other countries on board, whether it's through multilateral fora like the UN or on a bilateral basis, and then present that to countries that you know would have different opinions like Russia and China. There's different vectors here, but you want consensus among like-minded nations first. And again, that there is a useful precedent here with the US and France and the US and the E3, because that's how the Iran deal was attempted to be fixed in early 2018. It was the US had issues with the deal. The 3 European countries that shared similar norms with the US and similar issues with Iran convened to attempt to fix the deal. And it was assumed that if they did come to a fix, they would workshop that with the P5+1 and then workshop that with Iran. So you can use one body and work it all the way out. And I think the G7 is one body that can begin to talk about this tax, that can begin to talk about some of these issues and workshop it out.
But because the next G7 is smack in the middle of a campaign, can we write it off? Or will something happen?
On this issue, no. I think that the U.S. definitely has a desire, particularly under the U.S. president, to highlight American leadership, to highlight issues that this president in particular wants to put forward, areas where he wants to build a global consensus. You can definitely expect the Iran issue to be one of them. You can expect issues that are not a priority for this president or this party or this country to be much lower on the G7 agenda, if not at all. But I think the flexibility of the G7 agenda, coupled with the things that we know are sticky or more permanent interests for U.S. foreign policy and this president in particular, could provide another vector for this president to actually have a discussion about things near and dear to his heart. I think the Iran issue is going to be one of them.
The Iran issue, but Annick Cizel on these other issues, like they're trying to get this consensus on the best way to tax the internet economy at the level of the Organization of Economic and Cooperation Development. Mm-hmm. Are we going to get anywhere?
Actually, this is what the Trump administration has been asking for since 2017. They came back at it at the beginning, January 2018. They were asking for the OECD to take over and actually look at what could be done. We know that President Trump himself is not too friendly with the GAFA anyway at home. So maybe we can get somewhere on this, yes.
Did you have the impression, Hélène et Maureen, that that threat of sanctions and tariffs against French wine was now moot after today?
Well, we had a kind of awkward interaction actually at the end of the joint press conference between Emmanuel Macron and Donald Trump when a French journalist asked Donald Trump, "Your wife Melania sampled our French wine and seemed to like it. Does this mean that there will no longer be tariffs on French wine?" And Donald Trump didn't respond. But I think going back to the issue of taxation, it's important to remember that the G7, precisely because it is a club of like-minded nations, can kind of act as a steering body. There have been times in the past when the G7 has agreed on an issue, on an initiative, has brought that initiative to the G20 or to the OECD, and has made it into a multilateral governance tool. I'm thinking, for example, of the Financial Action Task Force that was originated by the G7. So I think that this this tax on the digital economy can have some real progress. And in fact, the G7 committed to having it be developed through the OECD by 2025. So I think that's quite a significant step forward for this tax, especially because it did create some sort of tensions and discord between the United States and France before the summit actually began.
All right. And your thoughts on what will happen next year in Miami or elsewhere, if it is Miami?
Well, it's sure going to be an interesting summit, especially because it's happening during election season for Donald Trump. So this will really be his opportunity to show that he does put America first, that he will promote and protect American interests, and that he is a world leader on the international stage. Something that's important when it comes to G7 summits is that the preparation it takes is quite intense. It takes a lot of time, preparation, attention to detail. It's something that Emmanuel Macron and his team have really excelled at here in Biarritz and in the lead up to the G7. But it's not something that Donald Trump is really known for. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Donald Trump also announced today that the summit will most likely take place at one of his properties in Miami. That also opens up the question of ethics. Is it ethical for the U.S. president to be hosting a summit in one of his properties where he'll most likely be making a significant amount of profit just based on the delegations that will be staying there or based on the journalists that will be staying there? So I think it'll be a really interesting summit to watch, and it'll definitely be a summit where Donald Trump will want the spotlight on him and to really play to his base right before the U.S. election.
All right, and we will, of course, follow the build-up. And before that, there'll be that UN General Assembly coming up next month in New York. I want to thank you, Hélène et Maureen, for being with us from Biarritz. I want to thank Benem Taliblu in Washington. Also, Annick Cizel, Thomas Friang, thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.